Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar on the series of the Vadis Euromed Civil Society, and especially of this, what we labeled as the month of Euromed Civil Society Dialogues. The second one on the row, actually, and this one is much more related to conditions and the pandemic that we have been going through for the last year. And it's really about how, on the one hand, the COVID-19 and the pandemic has affected civil society in particular during this one, and how civil society and civil society organizations have reacted and tried to readjust during the crisis, and definitely, which probably looks as much more important and much more challenging, what is going to be the future of civil society, with specific reference, of course, to the region that we are living in, and it is the Euromed space, or the Euromed civil society space of that. Along with us, we have two distinguished speakers. One of them is Nelly Corbel, and the other one, I believe it doesn't need much of introduction, which is Richard Youngs. The rationale of them is always that we would like to have a speaker from the north and the speaker from the south presenting different perspectives. This is one aspect of it. The other one is that we are trying to find a different angle, and that is, on the one hand, whether we can have activists and practitioners or academia and university professors, which of course doesn't mean that either that those roles are competitive to each other. On the contrary, many of us can hold both roles. So in that respect, we are trying to enrich our perspective and have as much as possible inputs to our challenge, to the challenge that we are all going to face as members of the civil society organization and the civil society activism in this area. So without any due respect, without losing more time, I would like to introduce first of all Nelly and Richard, and then move on. And just wanted to clarify the process is that after their presentations, we will have the two presentations, and then we open the floor to question and answers from the audience, which they are following us both from Zoom as well from Facebook of the Center for International and European Studies. This is one of the partners of this project, as we'll mention it. But also, it's not only questions that we would like to receive from the audience, but also your inputs and probably a bit of your experience during that time, and any ideas that you feel it's worth sharing in this panel that would assist us in the future. So, as we've said, the other partners of this project, on the one hand, is FOTOESSA, which is an NGO situated in Athens, in Greece, concentrating on bridging civil society activism with academia through education, research, and action. The other one are IEMED and the Center for, and the Croatian part, IEMED was the Euro-Mediterranean Institute located in Barcelona, the Center for International and European Studies at Kadir University, and the Center for Civil Society Research in Croatia and Zagreb. So let's start and present Nelly Corbel. It's nice to see you again. Nelly is actually sits on both sides of the Mediterranean, being a Franco-Egyptian, a French-Egyptian. She's an alumni of the Harvard University School, doing strategic management for leaders and for non-profit organizations, of the American University in Paris with an MA in International Affairs, and the Institut Catholique de Paris, if I pronounce it right, an MA in conflict sociology, active for the last 50 years in different projects, especially focusing on experience in capacity development, moderating conference and programs management in the field of civic education, citizenship development, and higher education and reform in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. And she has served in a number of leadership positions and boards, providing expertise for project advancement and policy recommendations. Currently, she is active in a number of and present and leading a number of initiatives as a founding executive director of Global Civic Consulting, as an executive board of the network of networking of Arab civic education, and founding committee and a member of the advisory board of Networking European Citizenship Education. Actually, they are sisters and brothers. And prior to that, she has served as the director of Gerhardt Center of Philanthropy and Civic Engagement at the American University of Cairo. And of course, she's a vice president of Lazot Foundation, which is an initiative especially advocating and working for developing the skills, personal skills, and for leaders from civil society organizations. And she will be, of course, covering the perspective from the South with an overall one. Just a final point, and then the floor is yours, is that we are taking it for granted, even though we are talking about the EuroMed space, that this is not one united space. It has particular characteristics, not only in the North and the South, but in between, within each one of them, you might find differences and divisions. And therefore, this is a general trend I would like to cover. And more specifically, we would like to, your inputs with anything that you would deviate from what we have presented, and looking forward to have a vibrant discussion afterwards. Nelly, the floor is yours. You've got around 10 minutes, and then we move on.
Thank you very much, Stefanos, for having me and for this very generous introduction. So I'll try to dive in. I'll try to be concise. The input I'm giving today is a collection of insights gathered from colleagues across the Arab region to try to get some sort of good idea, but in a snapshot manner of the situation in the different countries. Before I dive into really the impact on civil society of the COVID-19, I'd like to just remind us with a couple of, let's say, aspects that have been, in a way, let's say, factors in what happened. So as we all know, the Arab region, it tends to be an overpopulated with big cities, overcrowded cities, and with, let's say, a lower often economic development and a lot of marginalized communities, and mostly a lot of working poor. And obviously in this COVID-19 crisis, where social distanciation has been the key to succeeding, where lockdown has been the strategy across the globe, these two different factors that were pre-existing have obviously affected the way civil society has worked and the way the sanitary crisis has been managed and was able to, and those strategies were or were not able to be implemented. So there's two main aspects I'd like to address that seem to have to come out when you speak to civil society actors in the region mostly. It's, on the one hand, there seems to be really a CSO management in a crisis mode management. And on the other hand is the consequent increased inequalities and the looming economic crisis and the following unfortunate consequences that this may have. So in terms of the CSO management, if we dive in more at a, let's say, at an organizational level, like often in times of crisis, we tend to see that the funds are rightfully so in many ways directed towards whatever the crisis is. So currently it's going a lot to public health, health workers, health awareness, health education, et cetera, which is evidently needed. And it's thanks to those kinds of efforts that we can hope coming out of that crisis fairly soon. But obviously the let's say vicious aspect of this is the challenge that it causes is that funds, many organizations that were relying on a certain amount of funds are not necessarily finding that source of funding anymore, are not receiving the types of fundings that they're used to having. And therefore, there's been a lot of jobs that have been cut off. There's been a lot of multiple positions that have been put into one positions. Organizations find themselves relying on volunteers. And as we all know, volunteerism is something that we want to promote in civic engagement, but it cannot be the backbone of any long-term functioning organization. And also it has led the civil society organizations to revise a little bit their strategy and to also be in this reactionary mode and looking at urgent issues, maybe move from strategic, sustainable plans to more immediate reactions and move into charity rather than long-term philanthropy or acupuncture actions that can address the sources, the causes of the problem. And so the causes of problems have often tend to be put on the back burner. And as we can all imagine, this can lead to festering a situation where these are not addressed and consequently cannot actually provide long-term solutions. So this has been a little bit one of the challenges that NGOs have been able to work in, and this trap in which they're by definition finding themselves caught into. And also the challenge of these funds being redirected only and at a broad scale into the current crisis is what we've seen in past crises. It begs the question of how are the organizations receiving more funds able to manage when there's outpouring of financials at a fast pace with large amounts of money? How able they, in terms of capacity, they are to manage? And often what we see is that once the crisis stops, the funds also stops, leaving a lot of new initiatives to be unable to plan on the long term. So these are questions that we want to maybe wonder about. On the upside, this has led a lot of CSOs to self-reflect, to focus, to take time for planning, even though it's always very hard to plan on the long term during a crisis, but it has led them to maybe look at their core, their value, reorganize, work on institutionalization documents, the kind of work that we all, put at the bottom of the pile on a day-to-day basis. So on this level, it has been good because it allows them to really solidify their foundations. Then in terms of the aspects of increased inequalities and looming crisis, I'd say this is a little bit where the biggest challenge is the overall environment in which these CSOs are operating currently. So the question now is, how do you outreach in a virtual world? A lot of the communities that I mentioned that were marginalized find themselves in many ways even more so marginalized today, and community-based organizations find themselves in this very tricky ethical dilemma of understanding how to do outreach and how much to do outreach. On the one hand, if you don't go into these communities anymore because you're concerned about carrying the virus, what options are you giving them to address whatever issue you're addressing, whether it be poverty, unemployment, etc. And so outreach has been very much so of a challenge for these different organizations, how to go in the community, how to work in the community when technically social distanciation is the rule to be able to get us out of this crisis. And then the other aspect that from community to wider societal level, and we've seen that in countries, for example, like Algeria, is the public debate. A lot of different movements have been coming out because, again, of social distanciation. Gatherings have been stopped, and therefore that means demonstrations, that means public events, that means any sort of civic discussion that requires people to sit together in a room. And so in many ways, this crisis has hampered to a certain extent the public debate that now has to be moved online, and with all the limitations that it obviously leads to. Communities that have been left over in terms of not just your typical marginalized, let's say, poor communities, it's also, in the case of Jordan, has been refugee camps. These are perfect pools for the virus to contaminate, etc. But it's also a community that doesn't have roots by definition, and that needs a lot of support. And unfortunately, funds have been diverted towards the crisis and out of these programs dealing with refugees. Wars are still going around, refugees are still pouring, migration still happening. And so that unfortunately has been one of the forgotten work in countries like Jordan. And then in terms of the looming economic crisis and how also it directly impacts funders. So as Stefanos has pointed out, I work for a foundation, but I've also worked with other philanthropists, and it seems like especially private foundations, private philanthropies, because of what is going on economically, are having a hard time projecting, which makes a lot of sense, but consequently, they're being extremely cautious on their grant giving, and they're going to give to their usual grantees, but are not necessarily going to look at new projects supporting a new initiative. They're going to stay in the safe zone until we can see things are a little bit clearer, because of all the financial, instability that all of this could make cause on different endowments that private foundations are relying upon. Also at the level of the economics, as I'm sure it has been the case in all the countries represented in this discussion, a lot of new initiatives have had to stop. A lot of new businesses have had to stop. All businesses that have gatherings in countries that have gone into lockdown or in closing, for example, as we can all think of, restaurants, cafes, etc. A lot of businesses are closing, and therefore unemployment is skyrocketing in some countries. Government has been able, for example, in Jordan, to provide 25 to 37% of the salary of the people, so people have something to live off. But in most cases, these people are left with no compensation from the government. And one consequence we see in civil society is that because of that unemployment, highly skilled professionals are accepting maybe more mid-level or lower qualified positions for a smaller pay, and therefore leaving people who would be perfectly capable of having these jobs not able to get the jobs. And so we're seeing a downgrade of salary, and therefore of earning, and everything that that this leads to in terms of like economic consequences on a healthy society. So in conclusion, to not take too much of our time and leave time for discussion, I think this crisis brings out really two main aspects that I think could be interesting to discuss further. On the one hand, I think we've all learned that there's many things we were doing in person that we could very easily do online and save our carbon footprint, save money, save funding, etc. But there's also a lot of aspects that need human interaction at the social level, at the work level, like trust building in multi-stakeholder projects. Multi-stakeholder projects right now are having a hard time taking off because there's not that trust building happening with this in-person interaction. And of course, the psychological drama that all this situation has led to, with a lot of people being isolated, and I think psychologists and psychiatrists can all say how their agendas have been packed up lately. The other aspect is the digital gap. I think this has revealed just how wide, especially in the Arab region, the digital gap is at multiple level, at the community level, in terms of just pure structure of internet coverage, access to computers, access to phones, digital literacy, being able to just use the technology and having the internet to support that technology, but also at the level of civil society organizations who also don't necessarily have a computer per person, a phone per person, and people don't necessarily have the means to afford a computer on their own, on their personal money. And even if they were to be able, it's not necessarily a tool that is used in their work. And so there's an urgency for closing the digital gap, both for professionals, but also for community, and especially marginalized community, because during those times, this could have very well been a way for them to stay in touch with the rest of the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelly, and keeping time spent, even though it's always very good to hear you, to listen to you. Just as a brief, before I get into it, I just pinpointed one of the major characteristics of the region we've been talking about, which is, of course, the overcrowded population, which, of course, created a problem vis-a-vis the social distance, what was one of the prerequisites in order to deal with it. Of course, the economic side of the affected different aspects of civil society. The reality that the service-oriented civil societies were not anymore, civil society organizations were not anymore capable of addressing the constituencies, let's call it that way. And in that respect, they also had to re-evaluate their priorities, but also their organization aspects. On the positive side, then therefore they found themselves in a trap. On the positive side, I've underlined that they gave the opportunity to many organizations to look inwards and reevaluate, try to see whether they keep on walking in the same distance, try to capitalize on what they have learned through this pandemic. But on the other hand, going back to the positive side, we've seen that it has also found a lot the public debate spaces, which of course collected it. And then if I understood it properly, after the crisis, we do not expect, we all expect that the philanthropic and the child organization will definitely are in need to probably, yet they will seem to be, they're opening very cautious and waiting to see the direction, waiting to see how they can coordinate with others. So the main two outlets you have mentioned is actually related to the same aspect, which is the virtual world. Is on the one hand that we have seen the ability that we have familiarized ourselves with working through online, which also has a negative side because some of the activities which would allow us an outreach can be moved to online. Nonetheless, this cannot be at the expense of those activities that they need a personal contact and the building of trust. And of course, it also underlined the digital gap which exists not only between North and South, but also within different within different segments of the societies at large. And how can we deal with that in order not to enlarge the division, to not to enlarge the gap that exists between them? I've covered you more or less. Thank you. Okay, we move on now to Richard. Allow me, Richard, to present you first of all. I'm not sure if I need that, but I think just for the sake of it. So Dr. Richard Youngs, a senior fellow of Democracy, Conflict and Governance of Carnegie Europe, which is situated in Brussels. And he also works on EU foreign policy and on issues of international democracy, but also is a professor of international relations at the University of Warwick. Before joining Carnegie in July 2013, he was the director of the European think tank Pride, and he had held positions in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as also has been a Marie Curie Fellow. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Academy in Washington, D.C., from 2012 to 2010. He has published a number of books, 14, and the most recent one is the European Union and Global Politics, one which is much more related to a little bit more related to us is Civic Activism Unleashed, New Hope for Falls Down for Democracy, and Europe's Eastern Crisis, Geopolitics of Asymmetry in 2017. And may I add a publication of Carnegie Institute, which was more related on the COVID-19, published in December of 2020, Coronavirus as a Catalyst for Global Civil Society. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Stefanos, for inviting me. Good afternoon to everyone. I was asked to say a few initial words specifically about the situation of European civil society, that is civil society to the north of the Mediterranean. But very interestingly, the main points I wanted to put on the table are very, very similar to those that Nelly has suggested. So maybe there might be some significant similarities between trends to the south and the north of the Mediterranean. As Stefanos said, I'm a think tank analyst, so I can offer a general overview of trends. I don't have the kind of practitioner knowledge or expertise that Nelly has, or others of you, I imagine, on the call. So if we are talking about these general trends, as Nelly talked about in terms of the MENA countries, in European Union countries as well, I think we can see this dual face of the pandemic. So the last 15 months have been a time of great tragedy, unprecedented challenge and difficulty for European Union civil society. But also paradoxically, bizarrely in a way, it's also been a moment of opportunity and growth. So on the negative side of the equation, I think everyone on the call will be aware of the challenges involved. Governments across the EU have introduced new restrictions in the name of managing the pandemic that have affected civil society in a negative way. In the EU, these restrictions have not been as draconian or as severe as they have been elsewhere in the world, but nevertheless, they are real. They are not just affecting the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that tend to attract most of the media attention in terms of illiberal democratic backsliding, but they've been introduced in pretty much all European Union countries and non-EU European countries as well. It's probably the case that many of these restrictions were appropriate, were necessary to managing the crisis. In most cases, they had the support of the public and of opposition parties. But I think now at this point, we're getting to the crunch point where as states hopefully move out of the most acute phase of the pandemic and beyond emergency law provisions, we are seeing many governments attempting in very subtle ways to carry over some of these restrictions into the post-pandemic period. And I think that is the issue that is of great, potentially long-term significance to civil society, that civil freedoms don't quite go back to the level they were at before the pandemic, however justified the restrictions were during the worst period of the pandemic. So I think the situation is perhaps not as draconian or dramatic as many people feared might be the case at the beginning of the pandemic. I would say these are generally kind of second order restrictions with which civil society will need to grapple in the future. Just one example amongst many, I'm sure many people know, there are about half a dozen EU states, governments at the moment, trying to introduce long-term restrictions on the right to protest, the right to assembly, that it seems to me cannot be justified in terms of COVID management. And that is a direct result of the restrictions introduced over the last year and governments trying to carry these on into the future. So those restrictions are real. They exist across the whole of the EU and more broadly in European countries. Allied to that, we know the basic difficulties that many organizations have had to organize over the last year, 15 months. Just one example amongst many. You all know the Sardines movement in Italy was beginning to gather a lot of momentum, a lot of traction just before the pandemic hit, and a struggle to keep that momentum going, understandably so, during the subsequent months. So that pertains to very formal organized civil society organizations, as well as more informal social movements as well. So that's the more problematic side of the equation. And of course, that's focused a lot of the attention over the last year or 15 months. But there has been new growth in civil society as well on the north of the Mediterranean in recent months. So we've seen civic space shrink, but also grow in some ways. There was some fears amongst analysts at the beginning of the pandemic that societies across the EU would become somehow more passive. They would accept much more top-down technocratic governance during the pandemic. But in fact, this hasn't been the case. This hasn't been the case. In fact, societies have mobilized in multiple ways. And in fact, they become more organized and more active at multiple levels. To my mind, this has involved two separate trends. One, new organizations forming and existing organizations changing the focus of their activities. So both of those things have happened in parallel with each other. So we've seen a mushrooming of new community level organizations working specifically around the health emergency, helping the delivery of local services, liaising with local authorities, or often working in partnership with government authorities. And we've seen organizations that in the past have been focused more on, let's say, macro level political issues, human rights, and the like, also turning their attention to COVID-related activities as well. So clearly this is an enormously positive trend. It's shown a lot of dynamism and a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation amongst civil society activists and local communities. I think the potentially long-term benefit of this is that civil society activity is now more attuned to local concerns and more attuned to the need to build up local legitimacy. I think the long-term challenge will be whether civil society organizations working on these kind of very practical agendas can also keep the focus on the more sensitive and political agendas at the same time. During the pandemic, as Nelly was talking about, there's understandably been a change of focus, a change of priority towards health and social issues, and to some extent away from the big overarching political issues. So I think a challenge in the post-COVID period will be how far CSOs and social movements go back to their more pre-established political agendas, and whether they can combine those effectively with the longer term impacts of COVID. As Nelly was saying, in regards of MENA, in the EU too, we've seen a lot of activism move online. I was going to make the same point about the digital divide. So that's not just a MENA issue, it's an issue of real significance, I think, Nelly, on the north of the Mediterranean as well. Quite a lot of funding is going into trying to narrow this digital divide, but it is a real concern. I think, Stefanos, you make the really good point that I think the future challenge building on that transfer online is whether organizations are able to combine the best of online deliberation with their more traditional offline activities as well. We all know that digital technology comes with a lot of risks, a lot of sensitivities that civil society organizations have become a lot more alert to over the last several years. So I think we need to be aware of the fact that this move online carries with it enormous opportunities, but some risks as well. And then I would also make the point, just to move towards finishing off, there's also been a growth not just in organized civil society activity, but in protests as well. So despite all the restrictions coming from governments over the last year, 15 months, we've actually seen an increase in protests across the EU. So COVID management has not killed off large-scale movement like protests. In Kadir, we actually have a tracker monitoring the number of protests across Europe and more broadly on a global scale. There's actually been an uptick of protests over the last year. So protests are coming back. Many of these are against the COVID restrictions. They're in favor of human rights. They're against police repression and the like. So they do potentially signal an intensification of the human rights agenda. But I think we all know many of these protests are in fact rather problematic from a human rights perspective. They are being led by far-right groups, by rather illiberal movements. They are mobilized against lockdowns. They are using a democracy or human rights narrative, but on the part of organizations not exactly known for their commitment to liberal values. So I think that challenge of this more libertarian or illiberal form of civil society activism is a challenge, or is a phenomenon, a trend that is likely to carry over into the post-COVID period as well. To conclude then, I think those are the main trends that are going on north of the Mediterranean. I think, Nelly, you perhaps see there's some resonance there with what you were drawing out as the main trends on the south of the Mediterranean. I think one concluding issue of relevance to Euromed questions is that I think a lot of activism understandably has perhaps turned inwards and focused on very domestic or local imperatives related to the health crisis. And some of the big Euromed issues perhaps have not been at the forefront of people's attention over the last few months. That may be about to change now. I think CSOs are now engaging and mobilizing a bit more around the need for European countries to be more generous in the provision of vaccines and in the provision of long-term recovery assistance. But I think that is another challenge we do need to put on the table, whether this turn inwards of European civil society, understandable in the circumstances, over the longer term may carry some risks for Euro-Med cooperation in the civic sphere. And then the funding issue is, as Nelly said, I think likely to be a real challenge, not just in the south, but also in the north. And I think governments are aware of this. Civil society organizations are lobbying hard. The EU has just introduced an interesting new program with quite a large budget of additional money to try and help civil society through this difficult period, focused on the issue of human rights and democratic values that are recognized to be in danger in many parts of the EU. So there is some silver lining there, even as governments' budgets are squeezed. There are some actors like the European Union recognizing exactly the danger that Nelly put on the table, that for all the very admirable activity and uptick in mobilization that we've seen over the last year, if the funds begin to dry up as we move into the potentially prolonged economic crisis on the back of COVID, then longer term, I think civil society will face some really significant difficulties.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a very concise and very rich presentation. I will open the floor, of course, to the questions, but then allow me just to go very quickly to what you have just described. The first point is a lot of similarities between North and South in a number of issues. The other very important point that I took is that it looks like activism, which in one way one should expect that it has been, well, at least on hold, it hasn't happened, but we still have seen such movements flourishing with the different areas. And one of the things I've seen and realized that nothing can be seen as black and white. There is always black and white together, rather than only one of the or gray in between. And in that respect, in terms of there is the threat of on the one hand, the threat of extended restrictions that existed to be also maintained after COVID-19, and therefore that would limit the civil freedoms, at least in some of the countries of Europe. At the same time, we have seen a movement in the Gulf of protests towards that issue and the human rights, yet not by the traditional, shall we say, center to left movements, but on the contrary, on some illiberal, or shall we say, conservative civil society orientation, or even ultra right-wing groups. So at the facade of freedom and liberty, they would challenge this one. And that there is the funding issue, which also always in the case, the change of focus, and this also has both negative and positive aspects in the respects that a lot of civil society organizations have reoriented their activities and their focus in order to be helpful, in order to provide service to the local community, which of course has probably increased their acceptance and the legitimacy in the local level. At the same time, it raises the question whether they would be able either to switch to their traditional, more political oriented agenda, or even better, to maintain both sides of the equation active, which of course will definitely strengthen their legitimacy domestically. We have seen the civil society organization operating alongside with the government assisting, and in some respects probably replacing it. And then we move on, one of the other side of the coin in terms of the Euro-Med partnership, again, two different trends, or probably a trend which is the European civil society organizations, and of course because of the priorities, looking inwards, but at the same time realizing, and this is one of the challenges, is that the need for Europe, especially if Europe or the European Union would like to maintain or increase their role in world politics, that they need to, in their funding and their openness of policies and support, not to exclude the other side, especially in the neighboring areas. And even though it is of course expected that after the crisis is gone, the economic crisis will probably follow in a certain, it would still be around, and a lot of funding will flourish into them, it would be flooded the market, and there is a lot of lobbying towards that direction from civil society organization and then an open eye and a willing ear from the side of the European Union in order to invest in a number of issues that would allow for strengthening the capabilities, that would allow for strengthening the activism of civil society organization towards the issues which are related to democratization, to civil liberties, and so on and so forth. I guess this is more of it, and we have covered it. And now we open the floor. Just as you've mentioned, it's very interesting that you've probably seen them, which is related to it, the results of the elections in Spain, which interestingly enough, the right-wing parties or the populist parties have won elections, and one of the reasons was based on actually challenging the lockdown that the central government had expected. So while even though arguably supported by more ultra-right-wing parties, the agenda was liberty and freedom in relation to a very hot topic. So this actually probably illustrates what you're saying, or at least the need probably for opening the discourse about the needs and the dialogue and probably the cooperation between the three sides of what I call the triangle between civil society, the state apparatus, the international organization, and the private market. So I guess before I open the floor to anyone else, I just want to ask whether Nelly would like to pose any question, and then open the floor to the rest of us to participate in some questions. Nelly?
No, I'm actually very much enjoying the fact to hear that at the end of the day, both sides of the Mediterranean are encountering the same, and glad to hear the EU is thinking about this long-term civil society sustainability. No, I'd rather have the audience ask their questions. Thanks.
If I may, I think I was actually going to ask a question, and in a way you did answer it, Richard, in that in your last book on civic society activists, you've mentioned this new movement of activists which were more locally oriented. And I just found very interesting this combination. That on one hand, you have locally driven movements, nonetheless, at the same time, along the side, of course, of traditional civil society organizations, and then grassroots and community-based forms that you've named them. Nonetheless, we have seen, as I've mentioned, the crisis have indicated the need for more local relevance, let's say, for the civil society activities of a different nature, of course, much more related to the needs of the locals. But that also, for me, raises the question, and which I would just bring it to the other side. While you have identified that the European Union has already realized the need, and therefore it's willing to invest, is the first question whether such an investment would also take the form of investing on capacity building and knowledge transfer, so that they would be able to function and reduce probably the dependence of those organizations on such funds, but also be able to generate their needed funds. What happens in the South, where there is an absence of such shall we say, such a collective entity like the European Union? I mean, whether we can see something like that happening in the Union for the Mediterranean, what has been whether we can see any similar acts on the side of the Arab League, or this kind of things. Let's start with this one, and then we'll move on to other questions. And probably, yeah, let's deal with this one, and then we'll go on.
Yes, I mean, actually, the EU has boosted its funding to southern Mediterranean countries under the EMP and other various initiatives. It has a whole range of different budgets for this kind of funding. It'd be interesting to see what people's experiences are who are on the call. But in Carnegie, we have heard cases of organizations receiving money for exactly that longer term capacity building, stefanos, who've had the funds cut and reoriented towards short-term COVID emergencies. I have some sympathy with EU policymakers, because in a way if they weren't shifting the funds into the COVID emergency, people would criticize them for not doing that. But then when they do shift the funds, understandably, organized civil society recipients are worried about the longer term capacity building. So one does appreciate it's a very, very difficult balancing act. I think it's, as long as over the long term, EU does get back to this longer term capacity building and doesn't inadvertently contribute to a situation where other issues, the more controversial human rights or political issues, are pushed off the agenda, or the migration issues, where we know the EU doesn't have a particularly good story to tell in terms of what Frontex is doing, and the legal action being taken against Frontex that CSOs are mobilized on and continue to be mobilized on during the crisis. So I think that will be important, not to affect the longer term activities in terms of civil society funding. If I may, just on the issue of these local organizations, I think that is a growth area. I think it's important to recognize they're not completely pushing out the more established civil society organizations. I mean, sometimes these it's framed as if there's a black and white choice between the newer types of civic activism and the more established NGOs. But I think there's space for both of those types of organizations. They both bring different kinds of skills and advantages to the table. And perhaps a slightly positive interpretation of what's happened during the pandemic is that those two levels of activism have learned to work together a bit more productively. Interestingly, in the Carnegie study that you mentioned, Stefanos, we found this kind of local intensity of community self-help organization has taken place both in countries where governments have reacted well to the pandemic, and they've been keen to work cooperatively with civil society because they recognize that civil society is needed for an effective COVID response. And in countries where governments have reacted very poorly and ineffectively, and local groups have mobilized in a way to compensate for their government's failures. So in some countries, it's tightened the partnership between civil society and governments. In others, it's had exactly the opposite effect, and it's intensified the confrontation between civil society and underperforming governments.
Okay, before I move on to Dimitri's question, I just wanted to actually raise an issue to Nelly, which is because she's working for a long time into that direction, and whether this crisis has underlined the need is that we have underlined a number of issues. First of all, with regard to the South, whether we have seen that the handling of the pandemic crisis has raised has laid the burden on vis-a-vis the legitimacy of those regimes in the South, and whether the way they handled has increased the pressure towards them to move at least towards introducing reforms, at least with regard to their governance style, rather than opening up to the system. That's one question. And the other one, which I wanted to ask you, is that we have described a number of challenges for civil society. I just wanted to wonder whether, and you've mentioned that there is an opportunity to look inwards, whether we can identify weaknesses of the civil society as it stands within, and something that those organizations have to deal with them irrespective of the funds, but they have to work internally in order to meet their weaknesses, and therefore to be able to perform a better role in these triangular relations.
So in terms of the first question, the government, when it comes to governments in the South Med, I'm not sure any sort of crisis would necessarily make these governments operate differently. But on the other hand, I do empathize with the point that Richard made about how policymakers nowadays, whatever they do at the end of the day is quite challenging. If you take all these different countries, that's why I mentioned the working poors. We've seen this in India as well, and we see how the situation has turned out in the most terrible manner. These are countries that are extremely hard to to manage a health sanitary crisis, because there's already a health sanitary crisis. There's already, unfortunately, a lack of sanitary infrastructures. As I mentioned, overcrowdedness, which is potentially your worst enemy when trying to deal with a pandemic. And unfortunately, weak health system. I don't remember the exact number, but at the time a year ago, where we're all kind of counting our oxygen, machines to see for intensive care units, if you could handle, in Egypt, which is roughly 100 million inhabitants, there was something like 500 machines. So I'm not quite sure what you're, even the most capable government, I'm not quite sure what you can do when you face these kinds of numbers. And on the other hand, you have working poors who tell you, well, maybe I risk to die from this disease, but if I don't go to work, I'll still die from not working. So I think almost this, there's been criticism of the government. It's been under a lot of criticism for not necessarily managing this crisis in the right way. But to be honest, I don't even know what the right way is when it comes to the numbers. And I think that this COVID-19, the disease itself, attacks violently whatever weakness you have in your own body. And I think that it does the exact same thing in the societies it goes in. It shows, it crumbles already extremely weak points. So if you look at the Arab region, the weak points is an already terrible economic situation, as I mentioned, with the unemployment, etc., but also a healthcare system that is just not up to par with the number of people that live in this region, but also in terms of quality of access. There is, we were talking about digital divide, there is a health divide. Depending on your income, depending on your revenues, you will have a certain access to the healthcare system in private hospitals, etc., that you may not have if you do not have that kind of income. So all of these issues have come out. And of course, this is when we talk about, civil society, and, you were asking in your question, when it comes to civil society, it shows how there is a need for these for all organizations, whether it's organized civil society organizations, but also the civic debate in general, to, let's say, restructure a little bit the basis of the, maybe that's old school, but of the welfare state, of these kinds of basic services, and the importance of these basic services for a healthy society to just operate. And there's good food, shelter, and health. And all of this, this 1 year pandemic is crumbling because it was not stable in the first place. So I hope it somehow answers.
Richard, would like to add anything? Shall I move to other questions?
I agree with Nelly. I think the really significant debates in the future will be about, this also relates to one of the questions in the chat about the main lessons to learn. I think the interlinkages between the kind of service delivery in health and other crises with these broader issues of the economic model, economic injustices, lack of basic state capacities, and also the broader rights agenda. That's a very difficult kind of interconnected nexus of issues that civil society will have to get to grips with, maybe rather than just focusing on individual parts of that puzzle in that activism in the future. I think the pandemic shows the interrelationship between all these different levels of societal challenges.
And I get to Dimitris Triantafylou. He raised the question: how can we make this pandemic and post-pandemic moment of transcendental one for the role of civil society in the European Union and the southern neighborhood, and how can we move beyond business as usual to allow for greater consideration of CSOs as dialogue partners for governments and their inclusion in all recovery and resilience schemes that governments are developing? Or is this too utopic? I just want to add, as I've said, the other part of the triangular is whether we see in the future, not a challenge, but also what would formulate what the direction or the challenges that the civil society would face vis-a-vis the private sector and the philanthropy at large. Nelly?
Yeah, I was sorry. I was just thinking about Dimitri's question, and of course, there's always a
yes, yeah, sorry, you were thinking
of utopia in this, but I do think, and I was mentioning how outreach is challenging for community-based organization in marginalized communities, but this crisis has opened a door and given an opportunity for CSOs to, when it comes to partnership and outreach at a more global international level, it actually has been an opportunity, because since, for example, in this webinar that we're attending, we could have people from all over the world attend and join in these discussions, which we didn't used to have pre-COVID-19. And as we all know, when it comes to consultation at a policy level or at a even UN international agency level, there is the unfortunate but just very human practical aspect of outreaching to usual suspects, outreaching to people that are within our network, are within maybe our weak ties at best, one level of connection, and that's it. This crisis, in the end, for just at a personal level, has allowed me to meet people from all over the world through these different events that have been moved online. And so I think that, to me, and answering his question, how can we move beyond, is using these opportunities that we have to connect so easily, where it has become almost normal to have these events online, and connect more easily to non-usual suspects, to people that we don't necessarily already know, and use the power of weak ties to broaden and to create this sort of networking dynamic across civil society organizations and policymakers, and even interdisciplinary, to move even beyond just these, let's say, professions or expertise that are always surrounding these types of sociological, economical, political knowledge, but really move beyond even maybe other types of expertise, like, I don't know, psychology, urban planning, etc., to look at the problem from a more holistic point of view, and use this opportunity we have.
Thank you, Nelly. Richard?
Hi to Dimitri. Good question. How to harness this as a positive opportunity? I would say hammer home the narrative that the pandemic has shown that civil society matters. It matters to everyday, concrete, tangible life and death issues. It's not a sphere working on kind of abstract rights issues that are not relevant in a real sense to people's everyday lives. I think the lesson there for the Euro-Mediterranean Union and to IEMED policymakers is to try and, in the future, ground the cooperation on civil society across the Mediterranean in these kind of real life issues, and try and strengthen those links between the big political rights kind of issues that we're all concerned with on the one hand, and local communities' more day-to-day issues on the other hand. I think perhaps, as Nelly says, the pandemic at least opened slightly the door to us being able to craft a message in those terms more so than in the past.
So you did mention it, and just first of all, we have, as we discussed, is that what we will see in the post pandemic world and the situation of civil society and the evolution are not related only to the challenges of the crisis, this crisis, but they were already ongoing evolution, like the rise of the liberal movements and so on and so forth. So do you consider that some of those challenges that pre-existed and they're moving forward, they were actually halted? Or that, well, or we say, or can, or reverse, or we actually, all those challenges that we have faced, we have been facing lately, or at least civil society have been faced lately, are going to be there. They are going to back to the, or one of the crisis has, I think, to a certain degree, you underline that probably it increased some of them, but do you see any of the crisis in terms of those challenges that have been halted back? As I mean, probably as a, yeah, sorry.
I can start off. Personally, I think it's a bit too premature to make any kind of definitive conclusion on that. The way that discussion has been framed amongst many European analysts, Stefanos, is in terms of whether the pandemic has basically killed off the case for populists, because it's brought to the forefront the need for more kind of sensible, pragmatic, evidence-based policy making. Personally, I mean, it's clear if you look at the polls that a number of the populist parties have plateaued or declined slightly over the last 12 or 15 months. But I think there is at least a risk that as we move into the next phase, that it's likely to be dominated by the economic costs of the pandemic rather than the health emergency itself. It could be that opens a period of very, very difficult politics over the redistribution of the costs of the crisis. And it could be at that moment the populists come back into the game and their narrative begins to gain resonance and gain traction again. So I think it would be premature to declare victory over European populists. I think this is still a real problem, and one in which I think European civil society needs to keep mobilizing and keep a focus on very, very strongly. Some of the rights-based activism has been on the back foot, has been defensive in recent years because governments and very illiberal parties have tried to restrict its activities. And we still need to be attentive to that as being a real danger, quite separate from all the emergency issues revolving around the pandemic. That continues for me to be a very serious underlying structural political problem that the EU suffers from.
So in that respect, it is a window of an opportunity, but for the right-minded. But this needs to be properly, I guess, properly advertised or promoted, and definitely, as you've mentioned, then the economic issue afterwards to be handled in such a way that would not allow for the populists to gain a little bit of the ground that they have lost now. Good. A last point I wanted to raise also with regard to the European Union, which I think it started earlier, but whether you consider that the flood or this opening of the capital and the funding available, whether we can see, and I think it was already on the making, a reevaluate or a change in terms of the evaluation of those projects, of the targets, and whether the impact measurement would become more essential for granting those funds that are available. So a little bit more professionalism, let's call it this way, would be expected from civil society performing and handling funds of the European Union or other funders that may. I believe that because I know that Nelly is working with funds and sponsors from the other side of the Atlantic, and therefore this is a similar rationale which applies to the other side of the Atlantic as well. Yeah,
I think on the first question, if anything, it should push policy in the opposite direction of being a bit more flexible, because obviously during the pandemic, you can't impose log frames and these very heavy bureaucratic frames on organizations that need the capacity to be able to react quickly and in a flexible and agile way. And then secondly, I think you hit the nail on the head, Stefanos, when you say the crucial thing will be how the pandemic, the economics of the post-pandemic period are managed in order to head off more authoritarian tendencies in the many countries and in EU states, populist traits, also in non-EU European countries as well, where these things are equally a problem. I think for me there, civil society will have a very important role in the decision-making over how the post-COVID recovery funds are spent. I mean, the EU has promised to give CSOs some kind of voice in how this huge amount of funding will be distributed that the EU's agreed to fund in the post-COVID period. But so far, the channels available for civil society organizations to influence the debates about how the funding is spent after the pandemic are very, very limited. And governments so far are managing these funds in a rather top-down and not very open or transparent way. Personally, I think that's the wrong way to go. One understands that they need to get the process speeded up and implemented quickly, but I think you're right, Stefanos, in the long term, this needs to be a fully inclusive and participative process. Otherwise it's likely to foster more resentment and frustration with governments over the medium term. And that will provide very fertile ground, I think, for populists to regain political support potentially over the next 2 or 3 years.
But how can you, I mean, this was always my question, my question mark is that we label this one, but can really civil society act collectively? Because you've mentioned that it would give a voice to the civil society, but how are they going to be expressed? Are we going to see some consortiums being created? Are we going to see the networks and hopefully organizations like the Anna Lindh Foundation being drawn into the equation, or other networks, or in terms of civic education, Nelly's involved with NACI and NACI? I mean, how can the civil societies of this region act collectively rather than individually?
It's I don't know if Richard, you want to add something here, but I think that's the eternal question. It was already a challenge before COVID-19, and not being able to meet in person and have events in person has not made the situation much easier on this. And I personally think it's a little bit premature to find a solution on how to work together when people are just still trying to figure out how to work. Simply just keep, readjusting their lives to the current challenge. So that's why I was looking a little skeptical, is because I'd love to have an answer to that question, but I just think at this point at least in the organizations I work with, we're not there yet.
So do you see a positive role to such as of an intermediary to networks or large networks like the Anna Lindh Foundation? But on the other side, on the other hand, whether if they acquire such a role, that would lead them to become institutionalized and therefore weaken their legitimacy in a certain way? Or is it going to be based
perhaps a challenge in the future for Anna Lindh and other kind of network-based civic initiatives under the IEMED umbrella will be as if they can act as kind of intermediaries between the funding and the new kind of community-based organizations that have emerged during the pandemic. I think that's the challenge, because though some of these newer organizations are not the kind of very well structured formal CSOs with whom these networks are used to working. So there are new partners on the scene, but how far the networks can actually reach down to engage with those effectively, I think it's not yet clear. And maybe in that sense, the kind of networks that you're talking about, Stefanos, also need to rethink their own mission and their own way of working.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of the networks, I think it will be very important after this to kind of be able to meet virtually, in person, ideally in person, but to make, as we would say in French, an état des lieux, to see a little bit the current status, where we're at, how has it impacted everybody's work, what lesson, I see one of the question is, what are the lessons learned, and ask, in a wider consultation with all these networks, and be able to have a clear picture of the post-COVID. Agendas have obviously changed, ways of working have obviously changed, partnerships have evolved, ways to partner have evolved, and I don't think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but I don't think that out there is yet a full understanding of just how deep all this has impacted the way people are working, but also the kind of change of paradigm of the way people are perceiving. I think there's been a major change in perception of the work, of the priorities, of what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So I think that these networks need to, as soon as possible, call in for proper consultations to just sit and just see where are we at and how do we take it from there.
I don't want to abuse more of your time, and as we are running time, and really in depth to your presence in this meeting, I just want to finish with a point that Dimitris Kavouras is making, even though it's a Greek word, he lives in Alexandria, a Greek name. He just underlines exactly that, the comparison of how the South dealt with the North, starting from a different point and from a different GDP would create a different result. But I guess that's why we, in order to judge the way that each country or each regime has dealt with the government, it has to be in comparative matter and in relation to the resources at their disposal. But I guess some of the general trends are there in any case. So after finishing, I think if I'm as one of these aims of this project for Vadis EuroMed Civil Society is to end up with some policy recommendations, I've realized very, gladly and proudly that we can see a new role or a stronger role for the Anna Lindh Foundation, which is that of the intermediary role between the civil society and the ability to reach those informal new forms, informal groups that have emerged and the major ones. And I guess, if I understood it, then we shouldn't be quick and to react in a certain aspect, but take a bit of my time, even though sometimes it doesn't sound as the needed thing to do. But in any case, we need to be able to evaluate the real trends and the challenges and the best way to deal with them, rather than run in order to offer some solutions, which is not only whether they are the right one or the wrong ones, but it's also the ownership of those solutions, so that we shared between institutions like the European Union and the governments on the one hand, and the civil society and societies at large on the other. So thank you very, very much. If not for our public, at least definitely I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure I'm looking forward to other such events. We'll keep you posted to the how this project evolves, and hopefully once we've reached some of our conclusions, allow me to share it with you and have additional input with that. Again, thank you very much. Good night. Stay safe for the time being yet, and hopefully be free soon in a real literary meaning of the word. Goodbye.